Catch up now with the Labor opposition leader in New South Wales, Chris Minns, joining us live from Parliament House. Good to talk to you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
I think it's been difficult for oppositions around the country during the pandemic. I think most governments, Labor and Liberal, have gone too far in their pandemic responses and border closures at times. But I've been critical of opposition's, Labor and Liberal, for not putting up a strong alternative. You've broken out on the weekend and opposed Gladys Berejiklian's curfew in those hotspot areas, affecting about 2 million people in Sydney. Why have you taken that step? And do you believe it's important for you to now challenge some of these responses?
Well, we've approached the pandemic in a constructive way. We haven't tried to do opposition for opposition's sake or score cheap political points. My mantra's really been, look, there'll be plenty of time for politics as soon as the pandemic's over. But I've been really concerned about the curfew. As you said, 2 million people being locked up, have to be in their homes by 9 o'clock every evening. And it seemed like an arbitrary response, not considered, not based on the health advice, not asked for by the Chief Health Officer. And late this afternoon, in fact, the Deputy Premier has broken ranks from the Premier herself and said that he doesn't support it either. And it was only brought in because of media pressure. So, Chris, I'm hoping some common sense prevails here. The Premier changes her mind. We lift these curfews and just make decisions based on common sense to get through this difficult period.
Well, there's no doubt you're right. There's not been medical advice in Victoria previously, or that we've seen in New South Wales to say a curfew is needed. It seems an arbitrary measure. You're right to oppose it. And as you mentioned, just in the last few minutes, the Deputy Premier, John Barilaro, has given strength to your arm as the opposition leader. Here he is, the Deputy Premier.
The idea of a curfew is one that was put in place in an area that was so out of control, and you'd question its ability to work. And if you look at the numbers since we put the curfew in, nothing's occurred, nothing's changed, numbers continue to rise. So no, I won't impose curfews on the people of Dubbo when I know it does nothing more than hurt the well-being of that community.
Well, there you go. As opposition leader, some of your arguments being echoed by the Deputy Premier. But now I want to take this a bit further. Now, you don't want to be oppositionist for opposition's sake during a pandemic, but if the responses have been wrong by the state governments, it's because they've gone too far too often. Why haven't you challenged the government when they've gone too far with those limitations? For instance, when we've seen police officers fining people for sitting in the open air in the sunshine, those people need a voice. Surely a political opposition is that voice.
Well, look, early on in the pandemic, we did have an issue with compliance. There was obviously a big community spread, particularly in parts of Western Sydney, but not just there, all over New South Wales, in fact. And we believe that it was appropriate, given the circumstances and given everybody's attempt to contain numbers at that point. Now, during the last few weeks, they've been able to get contingency plans in place for intensive care units across our public hospital network, and we've had time to get it right. Now, look, we'll back common sense and appropriate measures that we believe are in the public interest, but we think it's gone too far, or the Premier needs to change tack based on the evidence presented to her. We'll call that out too, and you have to give it to John Barilaro. He calls a spade a spade. He's not on my side of politics, but clearly he's going to say what he believes is right, and I think he's given credence to our position over the last 24 hours.
Do you believe the state government's been too quick to keep kids away from school, especially outside those hotspot areas?
Well, I'm certainly concerned about education. I'm a member of Parliament in southern Sydney. It's subject to the extra curfews, and I obviously am in constant contact with my principals and teachers in my community, and there's a real concern about the educational outcomes, particularly from kids from poor backgrounds, from families that don't speak English.
Shouldn't those kids be going back to school at the start of term 4? Shouldn't the start of term 4 be a return to school for New South Wales kids?
I have to say, Chris, we're comfortable with the decision of the government. Mandatory vaccinations for teachers, a mid-October timetable for those crucial years 11 and 12. I don't think anyone's going to get it perfect, but given the suite of options, the judgment call the government's made in relation to that, we believe is about right. And if it's not, if circumstances change, if the evidence warrants a change, then we'll do what we did in relation to curfews and call it out. But we'll do it in a constructive way with an ultimate aim from the opposition's point of view, of making sure we can return to life in a normal way, in a safe way.
And just finally, Chris, well, you would have seen those horrible pictures yesterday of Father's Day gatherings across the New South Wales-Queensland border at Tweed Heads, Coolangatta. That to me seems such an un-Australian division in our country. Do you believe that your Labor colleague in Queensland, Anastasia Palaszczuk, has just gone too hard with that border closure?
Well, look, I think everyone was keen for a border bubble because, as you know, Chris, those communities are really joined as one, whether you're north or south of the border. Some people work in Queensland, some people work in New South Wales. We've all got to come together and work on getting back to some kind of normality because those communities are suffering and we're worried about long-term economic damage and also societal damage for those Northern Rivers communities in the coming weeks and months. So that'll be a priority for the opposition going forward.
Thanks for joining us, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Chris Minns there, the New South Wales Labor opposition leader. He's called out that curfew, rightly so. It shouldn't be in place. He's already got some support, as you heard from the Deputy Premier, John Barilaro.